Okay, we are going to get started. We see that it is 11:30, so we want to make sure that we're honoring your time. We want to welcome everyone today to our presentation on comprehensive mental health systems in schools supporting learning environments. This is the kickoff to the comprehensive mental health series of the accelerated learning completed by Department of Education. My name is Dr. Dana Milakovic, and I am the mental health and alcohol and other drug specialist with the Department of Education.
And my name is Perry Rosen, and I'm a school psychologist and consulting psychologist with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, which is under the Department of Human Services. And this effort is really a collaboration between Pennsylvania's Department of Education and the Department of Human Services. Some of the information that we're going to be sharing with you today comes from various resources and initiatives from these state agencies and also nationally, including content that's been drawn from the National School Mental Health Curriculum. And you'll see this noted on slides as we go through. This curriculum was co-developed by the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and the National Center for School Mental Health to help schools understand the key components of comprehensive school mental health and the importance of engaging in strategic planning.
The mission of the Department of Education is to ensure that every learner has access to a world-class education system that academically prepares children and adults to succeed as productive citizens. Further, the department seeks to establish a culture that is committed to improving opportunities throughout the Commonwealth by ensuring that technical support, resources, and optimal learning environments are available for all students, whether children or adults.
The mission and vision of the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services is to ensure that every individual served by the Mental Health and Substance Abuse Service System will have the opportunity for growth, recovery, and inclusion in their community, have access to culturally competent services and supports of their choice, and enjoy a quality of life that includes family members and friends.
As we move forward into our presentation, you will notice that chat has been disabled, but the Q&A section is open. Please, if you have questions for either Perry or myself, please feel free to pop them into the question and answer, and we will either pause the presentation to answer them or answer them at the end.
All right, our schools, we know, are a critical context in which to address mental health, given that schools are a place where youth spend a majority of their time. While mental health has always been an important topic for our schools, we've really seen it come to the forefront over the past year, especially in terms of how schools can address mental health more broadly for everyone in the school community. With all of the questions and concerns about how to best support students and staff in schools, the growing focus on mental health has provided an opportunity to think about the systems and the supports that are in place in our schools and how to build those more intentionally and strategically. So we want to start today by highlighting the concept of learning environments, and we'll go through a few key definitions to set the stage for the various approaches that we're going to be discussing. Next slide, please. Thank you. Mental health is something that we know affects all of us and that we need to all work to maintain. Mental and physical health are equally important components of health, although we know that mental health tends to have stigma attached to it. We know that our mental and physical health are intertwined, and that poor mental health can increase physical health problems and vice versa, just as chronic physical health problems can increase mental health problems. When we think about mental health, we want to consider what leads to mental illness, but also what practices in schools support mental wellness for staff and students. And when we move toward this broader understanding of mental health as including wellness practices, it's much easier to recognize how this becomes part of creating equitable learning environments. Wellness practices are essential to the learning environment and also help to improve behavioral, emotional, and academic outcomes for our students.
We want to define trauma for you, and today's definition of trauma is based on the Pennsylvania Department of Education's trauma definition, which comes out of the PA School Code of 1949 and the Act 18 update that was put in play in 2019. This has three components. Component one is exposure to an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. But we know that exposure is only part of the picture. Events do not determine outcomes. And if you think about people you know who may have experienced similar traumatic events, for example, all of us who have experienced the pandemic across the United States, everyone has experienced the same event. However, there are differences in how we individually respond. This is why it's so important to remember that exposure to the event is not what determines trauma, but rather how the individual experiences that event. This is why components 2 and 3 are critical to understanding trauma. In order for trauma to have occurred, the impact of the event must be considered. A traumatic response has occurred when the event has lasting adverse impacts and creates significant difficulty in cognitive functioning and physical, social, emotional, mental, or spiritual well-being. I want to note that this definition is slightly different than others that may be present in Pennsylvania. As we move forward in Pennsylvania to becoming a trauma-informed healing state and state agencies identify their definitions, most will not include the cognitive functioning portion of PDE's definition. However, the base components are the same. The definition for equity for Pennsylvania's Department of Education is that every student has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, family background, and/or family income. And as Perry noted, ensuring that we are engaging in equitable practices that are trauma-informed are key components to ensuring that we're developing positive learning environments and setting the stage for student growth. Activities to foster these positive social, emotional, and behavioral skills and the well-being of all students, regardless of whether or not they are at risk for mental health problems, is what is the base core of a comprehensive mental health system. Mental health promotion is also known as Tier 1 services and supports. So that will be the focus of this presentation. It is important that we realize that as we move forward, we're talking about universal practices towards staff and students, regardless of the risk or protective factors that are related to mental health. And even if your school system is not engaged in a formal multi-tiered system of support, we are discussing practices that can be done for everyone. And so while we will sometimes refer to them as part of MTSS or part of a Tier 1, please know that these are things that you do daily for your students and your staff and do not require a formal MTSS program in order to benefit. Rooting the work being done through a trauma-informed lens allows us to focus on creating equitable, trauma-informed systems that support students. This work begins when staff and student wellness guide that we originally put out in the original roadmap, and it extends through organizational self-care and into database decisions around academics, assessment, and everyday practices. When we focus on psychological, emotional, and physical safety, we're identifying a cornerstone of creating safe, supportive, equitable learning environments. Creating these learning environments for students and staff will help mitigate the traumatic exposure experienced as a result of the pandemic. As we move forward, it is important to remember that we need to focus on the psychological and emotional safety of not only our students, families, and staff, but also our administrators. The roadmap offers resources to consider when determining effective methods of communication with stakeholders, universal practices to address social and emotional needs, create equitable, welcoming, and safe learning environments, and conditions for monitoring and supporting identified staff and students who are demonstrating needs and for emotional and psychological support. As we focus on creating equitable trauma-informed systems, we want to ensure we're addressing all levels of need through academic, behavioral, emotional, social, and physical safety, engagement with stakeholders through transparent, collaborative efforts, and rooting our work with communities and families in a mutually empowering partnership that is focused on engaging in culturally sensitive practices. For Pennsylvania, we are focused on the trauma-informed care values that are present on the screen, which include safety, trustworthiness, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, choice and voice, and cultural sensitivity. We know that mental health in schools matter. This has been something that has been discussed for years prior to the pandemic. And as Perry noted, the pandemic has really brought this into focus. But often we see this as an add-on practice. And today we want to talk about how you can integrate mental health into all aspects of the work being done in your school system. As we think about the mental health needs of staff, we know that empowering our staff to a path of healing can free up some of their emotional and mental capacity to support our students and therefore increase our student growth. It's important to recognize that there are many types of stress present. And again, thinking back to our definition of trauma, understanding that it is an experience of the individual that determines where we are in the positive, tolerable, or toxic stress level. And also understanding that we can't infer or make assumptions about where someone else is on that continuum, which is why we wanted to present different models of how you can provide universal supports and then what other tiered supports you can provide. So when we're thinking about positive stress, we're thinking about things that happen maybe every day or every week, meeting new people, starting a new job, entering into a new building if you're in the same school system, but you're changing classrooms. These are moderate, short-lived stress responses. So you'll see some increases in heart rate, some little bit of stress, but we're not feeling overwhelmed by the stress. And this is important because positive stress allows us to grow. And when we think about our students, it's really important that they encounter some positive stress because it's a fact of life and you need to be able to develop coping skills. But what's important is that positive stress can be managed in a system of support. So with adults, this is a social system of support, friends, colleague relationships. With students, this is a caring adult, someone in their life that they can talk to and they have that support system. Tolerable stress can have potential to negatively affect the developing brain. In our youth and in adults, it has the potential to kind of impact our executive functioning skills, impact our social skills, our organization, how we complete our job. And this occurs when we are faced with stress that we can't overcome immediately. It's not viewed as positive. It could be a death of someone in our life. It could be a serious illness. I would definitely say the pandemic falls into tolerable or toxic stress. The key difference is this is something you can't control, but you have a social support system. And it is that social support system that allows your brain to take breaks and recover so that there isn't a significant impact on your mental functioning. When we move into toxic stress, this is strong, unrelieved activation of your body's stress management system. So your brain is under constant attack from stress hormones. This is chronic, uncontrollable stress, and it is stress that you do not have the social system to cope with. This type of stress can be ongoing, or again, it can be a major lifetime event. So as we move forward, when we're talking about comprehensive mental health systems in schools and learning environments, we really want to think about, in terms of a tiered support for adults, all staff is going to be approached with some positive stress because it's every day. Tolerable stress, at least because of the pandemic, it is something they can't control. There are so many things that are out of our control with this. And we want to make sure we have systems in place so that it's not turning into a toxic stress situation where jobs are impacted and you will see performance deficits. So when we think about that, we want to think about how we avoid moving into a compassion fatigue and toxic stress situation. And we want to look at what are symptoms to look for. How do we look for symptoms early on so that we can minimize impact and create or return to a path of resilience? So this comes from the work of Dr. Eric Gentry, and he offered a way to understand compassion fatigue in a staged model. And then cat pictures were added to his work by some of the authors of the Compassion Resilience Toolkit for school leaders and staff. And they were added to create some fun and assist with remembering the stages. And this is a toolkit that I would definitely recommend for school systems, and it is in our resource center at the end. While we're not addressing this in depth in this presentation, Perry and I do believe that it is important to recognize without addressing staff wellness, we increase compassion fatigue and the likelihood that staff will either leave the field or become less effective. So supporting staff as individuals, as well as addressing systematic self-care, can support staff resiliency. So what are the signs of compassion fatigue in staff? You're going to see staff who is anxious and fearful. Seeing them withdraw, irritability is a sign of that. They're impatient, they're frustrated, impatient with staff, with administrators, with students. Poor concentration, poor memory. It ties into that toxic stress that we talked about, and it really ties into how can I use my cognitive functioning if I'm completely stressed out. Your brain doesn't have the capacity to do both, so it starts to shut down, and it addresses ways to keep us safe and is not allowing us to complete our work in an effective manner. Some vague physical complaints, you start seeing headaches, increased absenteeism, overwhelmed and confused, a lot of difficulty with problem solving or making decisions, and you see that lack of motivation and creativity. So creating equitable school systems, a roadmap for educational leaders, was the original roadmap, and this is the updated guide as we continue to move forward in our support for school systems. And the self-care for staff and systems focused on staff and student wellness. This was a pit stop in the educational journey, and the checklist for staff and student wellness was developed to allow school entities to target in on what area they need to focus on. We understand that not everyone is at the same place. So we want to be able to gear what you're looking for in order to support where you're at in your journey. Using this checklist with administrators or a school team can help you determine where to begin with supporting staff and student mental wellness. The checklist can be found on the roadmap itself or as a Google form for ease of usage in schools. Self-care in many circles has become this buzzword. Right now, when we focus on the pandemic and the rapid shift between in-person, hybrid, and online learning that are occurring in many of our schools, we want to address the fact that our students, our staff, and our families are faced with ongoing stress. Prior to the pandemic, we know that educator burnout and stress was high, and information coming in throughout the pandemic has shown us that this is increasing. The organizational self-care checklist that is on this slide and is part of our resources was developed by members of the Mental Health Technology and Transfer Center and Nebraska's Department of Education as part of their work in a learning collaborative focused on staff and organizational self-care. The organizational self-care checklist looks at areas of training and education, support and supervision, communication and work environment. And while it is not completely, like there's no way to develop a checklist that hits every single thing you want to think about in your school, it does highlight some things that are addressed as organizational self-care so that you're not starting from scratch and you can have some things to focus on.
So as schools continue to adapt to education in 2021 and beyond, it's important to think about how we're supporting the needs of the whole child, and that includes supports to promote mental wellness in all students and staff, as Dana just shared, identify mental health concerns when they arise, and then support students with known mental health needs and challenges. Schools that have been implementing a multi-tiered system of support, such as positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS, may need to modify or even expand some of their efforts to ensure that they're also addressing students' social, emotional, and behavioral wellness and mental health needs. But as Dana had mentioned, schools that have not utilized these frameworks or started to think about or plan for how to address student mental health in a systematic way, it's okay to reach out and ask for technical assistance on how and where to begin, but we're hoping that this presentation will really help with that. And whether or not schools are formally implementing these multi-tiered frameworks, integrating comprehensive mental health supports into the learning environment is going to enhance the educational experience for all students and truly benefit the entire school community. So moving on, over the next several slides, I'm going to review some of the data that helps to inform why we are discussing comprehensive school mental health that addresses the needs of all students. As Dana had shared, data regarding the effects of the pandemic on mental health continue to emerge. We don't have strong national data sets just yet that tell us how it's impacted, although locally in some areas, data is available sooner to indicate what the needs are. But what has been clear is that the rates of mental health concerns during the pandemic certainly have increased for both youth and adults. Focusing on youth here, prior to the pandemic, data showed us that mental health problems among youth in general were already common. So about 1 in 5 students was identified with a diagnosable mental health condition, and about 1 in 10 youth experienced some sort of mental health challenge that impacted their daily life in some way. And so what this means for us is that students with mental health needs are in every classroom, in every school. And it's also important to recognize that some longer term trends, even prior to the pandemic, have shown us that there's been a continued increase in both the prevalence and severity of mental disorders in children and adolescents. And what we know about adolescence is that it's a key developmental period for the onset of symptoms. But there's often a significant delay from that time of onset of symptoms to getting any kind of supportive treatment. And as we know, without intervention and support, or when mental health needs are unmet, symptoms can worsen, and this puts students at risk for a range of negative outcomes that impact their educational functioning. So for example, chronic absenteeism, school dropout, substance abuse, and even suicide, to name a few. If we look at the next slide, data from the Pennsylvania Youth Survey also supports the need to develop comprehensive mental health practices in schools that integrate into our learning environments and support our staff and students. So what you're looking at, not all of these represent a potential mental health need, of course, but we can think of many of these as some of the risk and protective factors for mental health challenges or disorders. Just to highlight a few of these, and if you're a part of a district that participates in the PAYS, you might have some of these facts and figures in mind for your own district. But looking at some of these as a state, what we can see is that a majority of students, over 80%, report feeling safe at school, but less than half enjoy being there. So what are we doing to help students feel more connected in their learning environments, knowing that connectedness is a huge protective factor for mental health concerns and suicide, and absolutely an important consideration for supportive learning environments? We also have seen, you can go back to that for a second. So we also have seen increases in bullying over the past 2 administrations of the PAYS. So approximately 1 in 4 students reporting that they experienced bullying in the year prior. Also another significant risk factor for youth mental health concerns and suicide. And also consistently over the past 3 PAYS administrations, we are seeing that about 1/3 of students report feelings of sadness or depression on most days. So it's helpful to think about our national statistics that I shared kind of in alignment with what we're seeing in our Pennsylvania students. And I just want to make a quick plug for the PAYS because it's going to be administered again this fall and really offers an opportunity for schools to access data directly from students about their attitudes, beliefs, and experiences, and can really help inform prevention efforts. And there are a few indicators on the PAYS that we know may be directly impacted by COVID, and this may give schools an opportunity to see that. For instance, some of the items here, including the death of a friend or family member, perhaps being worried about running out of food. That last one had previously been trending slightly downward. So I know that we're all interested to see how students have experienced this past year, and the PACE survey can provide a good indication of that for our Pennsylvania students. So moving ahead, we know that suicide is the second leading cause of death among youth, but it is important to underscore that suicide deaths in our youth are still rare. However, these data also come from the 2019 PACE and help us to understand how common suicidal thoughts and behaviors are among our youth. We also have recent national research that has helped us to identify some growing trends in suicide risk for specific populations of youth, including Black adolescents and in particular Black males. And we also know that students that identify as LGBTQ+ have a higher risk of suicide. So compared to the general population, 1 in about 2 to 3 of these youth seriously considered suicide in the past year. And so I just want to underscore that suicide prevention efforts do overlap with comprehensive school mental health efforts in many ways. And the strategies that we'll be sharing are critical in helping to align your suicide prevention and comprehensive school mental health efforts. So we will be talking more about learning environments shortly, but how much does students' perception of safety at school really matter? And again, going back to our PACE, we know that about 80% of students in the last administration reported feeling safe at school. But this was a question that was recently explored by the Pennsylvania Department of Drug and Alcohol Program, their state epidemiological outcomes work group. And what the work group found was that students' perceptions of safety at school was associated with decreased odds of substance use. And so what you're seeing here is that a larger proportion of high school students who reported feeling unsafe at school, so those are the green bars, reported recent substance use in the past 30 days, including alcohol, cigarettes, vaping, and marijuana. And as for mental health, the work group further found that a higher proportion of high school students who felt unsafe at school experienced high levels of depression, suicide ideation, or had attempted suicide. And so ultimately, the work group reported that regardless of age, gender, race, ethnicity, and experiences of bullying, students who feel safe at school have lower likelihood of using substances, experiencing symptoms of depression, and suicidal thoughts when compared to students who do not feel safe at school. And this is really powerful data that, again, underscores our broader efforts to create these safe and positive learning environments. And this data is consistent with studies that show that feelings of safety and belonging are key factors in a positive school climate and can lead to improved outcomes from teenage years all the way through to adulthood. So Dana talked about the signs of compassion fatigue, stress and traumatic stress in adults. And in looking at this list in front of you now, you might see some similarities in terms of common signs or responses to trauma or stress in children that are of school age. And sometimes some of these do vary, of course, by developmental level and age, but we know that these are indicators that a student may need additional support in some manner. We don't always know exactly what it is, but in schools, we really focus on those observable behaviors of concern and look to the mechanisms that we have in place to make appropriate referrals. We know that pre-pandemic, statistics indicated high rates of exposure to trauma among youth. Estimates from the Department of Health Adverse Childhood Study indicated that 1/2 of all residents of Pennsylvania have had at least one adverse childhood experience. Over 19% have had 3 or more. And additionally, 38% of Pennsylvania residents have experienced either emotional or physical abuse in childhood. And so this Pennsylvania data coincides with national data that showed that pre-pandemic, of course, 2 out of 3 children in the country had been exposed to violence. And so knowing how common trauma exposure is, and also that trauma is a significant risk factor for mental health concerns and suicide, we need to ensure that we're considering how to create our learning environments as being trauma informed.
So as we continue to adapt to the changing environment and the landscape that we have across Pennsylvania, we want to make sure that we're addressing one thing in our planning that may seem overwhelming. While the majority of administrators and educators acknowledge the need for mental wellness supports for students, according to a study done through Cognito in Texas, less than half of them felt prepared to have conversations around mental health, trauma, or emotions. So as Perry mentioned, trauma is very common in our youth. So that means that in every single classroom across Pennsylvania, there are 1 to 5 children who have experienced traumatic events in their life and may be impacted. And the reality for our educational planning is that in order to set our staff and students up for success, we have to address the creation of positive learning environments. Positive learning environments have the ability to reduce stress hormones in our staff and our students, and this promotes calmer brains so that we have the capacity to both teach and the capacity to learn. When we think about school systems, we need to also think about how do we intersect with other influential factors in a youth's life. We know that despite the needs that we see and the referrals that we get through systems such as our student assistance program or universal screenings that are being done in many of our schools, we as school systems do not have the ability to focus on every single need of every single student. That capacity is just not present. So the intersections that we think about provide opportunities for partnership to address mental wellness in our staff and our students. While we spend the majority of our day with our students, they do go home, they have community outlets, they have community systems that they're engaged in. And when we create partnerships, we truly allow ourselves to wrap around the needs of our staff, our students, and our families. And this can help not only our staff, but our administrators support student needs while freeing up mental health resources that you have in your school system. Thinking about enhancing your learning environment through an equitable trauma-informed practices does not mean we want you to invest in another framework or a program. Instead, these practices are a way to enhance what your school or your district is already doing. This slide is going to present the MTSS system or multi-tiered system of support framework. However, just as a reminder, if you are not in a formal MTSS school, there are resources available to help you get started, or these are also things that you can do through a universal method as well. When we think about tier 1 practices in an MTSS model, we want to think about practices that we provide all students. Enhancing positive learning environments involves continuous improvement rooted in the 11 key features noted. We want to make sure we're addressing equity. We want high quality instruction, strategic use of our data, collaboration, family and community engagement, strong shared leadership, positive school climates, development of a continuum of support, strong universal practices, a systematic implementation, and we want to use evidence-based practices. I know that can seem overwhelming, but when you think about the things that are being done in your school system every day, this just requires you to start tweaking little things that you do throughout the day to ensure that you're addressing it in an equitable, trauma-informed manner and that you're tying your data not only to your academics and your testing, but also to your mental health. And Perry and I will talk in a little bit about data sources, but please know that this really is tying it all together so that we can support children's brains in order to continue to grow. Strong universal practices that address staff and student wellness do assist in the establishment of positive learning environments. When we build comprehensive mental health supports, we involve everyone in our school system in thoughtfully thinking about how do we do this? How do we put things in place that engage our students and our staff? How do we provide voices to our staff, our students, and our families? So mental health promotion in schools are any activities that foster positive social, emotional, and behavioral skills of well-being of students, regardless of whether or not they're at risk for mental health problems. So when we talked earlier and introduced this thought, we really wanted to focus on how do we address this for everybody. We want to have something that at a universal level supports positive learning environments. This is not just programs or curriculums, but it's also how you greet your students and your staff in the morning. How do you address student needs when they do occur? What do your discipline procedures and your policies look like? Anything that you do for all students and staff ties into mental health promotion. When you then layer on additional supports as needed by intentionally integrating those tier 2 and tier 3 supports, or for students who are not focused on an MTSS or tiered system formally, tier 2 and tier 3 supports are supports that you provide for students who have additional needs. So an example of a tier 2 could be mental health groups run by your school counselor, academic things that are tied into, I'm having reading difficulties, and so I am having behavioral outbursts in the school, and so we add additional reading supports. That's now a tier 2. And then tier 3 services are things that we really intentionally focus on and are individualized for students. The benefits for the schools include a cost savings because as mental health problems increase in severity, it requires more expensive and intensive mental health treatment. So when we address staff and student wellness as a part of mental health promotion, we're really looking at cost sharing, we're looking at decreased expenses in mental health supports, and we're also looking at decreasing the stigma around mental health and illnesses, which then promote staff ability to screen for concerns when you're in grade level meetings, to say to administrators, I'm struggling with this. I have students that are struggling, and it's not something that we don't talk about. We really want to normalize talking about mental health, the same as if we were talking about reading difficulties, math difficulties, writing difficulties in a school setting.
So when these comprehensive mental health systems are effective in schools, we know that they can have enormous value by contributing to improved student and whole school outcomes. And that includes the range of outcomes you're seeing here, including increased student engagement and connectedness within your school setting, improved academic outcomes. We know there is strong research that has shown the relationship between mental health supports and increased academic outcomes, fewer disciplinary actions within your school setting, and also things like fewer referrals to special education, or even the need for more restrictive placements for students that have special education needs. To move on to the next slide, this is a visual that's been put out by the National Association of School Psychologists, and it shows us a little bit more about what that continuum of mental health supports and services within the school setting can look like. And this is what Dana's already been describing. Research on best practices for comprehensive approaches to student academics or behavior rely on multi-tiered models. And that's also how we should be thinking about our school mental health. So again, we're going to repeat a few key things here. Whether or not your school or district has a formal MTSS structure in place, it's still helpful to conceptualize the supports and services being offered from a tiered standpoint in terms of what all students are going to need versus what some students need versus what just a few students may need in order to be successful. And there's several models out there with regard to what school mental health can look like across the tiers. But generally speaking, the first tier is, again, geared toward the entire student population, which we've been saying has been our focus of today's presentation, whereas tier 2 supports are for the students that might be experiencing some mild distress, possibly some functional impairment, or they could just have risk factors, be at risk for a given problem or concern, such as, when I shared data earlier, students maybe that have been bullied, right? And tier 3 supports are appropriate for students that may be experiencing some sort of significant stress and also functional impairment in their day-to-day. These students may be identified and often are diagnosed with some sort of social, emotional, behavioral need or mental health diagnosis, not necessarily. And the other piece of this that you're looking at is the staffing. And I just want to underscore the teaming that is a core component to these comprehensive mental health systems. And here the focus is on school mental health professionals, but really comprehensive school mental health approaches rely on collaboration and teaming that involves many professionals within the school setting, so administrators, your nurses, and also strategic partnerships with students, families, and also community health or mental health partners. But approaching comprehensive school mental health as part of this multi-tiered framework really rests on a few key foundations and core features, and that includes cultural responsiveness and equity. These are things Dana's mentioned, data-based decision-making, which we'll be talking more about, and embedding those evidence-informed services and supports. So this type of approach really helps ensure that we're more systematically identifying student needs and also monitoring progress. And in doing so, this helps us to reduce bias and subjectivity to better meet the needs of all students. So moving along, the first type of mental health promotion or universal supports or tier 1 activity that I'll be discussing is assessing and improving school climate. And so by definition from the National School Climate Center, school climate refers to the quality and character of school life. It's based on people's experiences of school and reflects the norms, goals, values, interpersonal relationships, teaching and learning practices, and organizational structures. So according to the Safe and Supportive Schools model, positive school climate involves the 3 components that you're seeing here. Engagement, which is really about strong relationships between students, teachers, families, and schools, and strong connections between schools and broader community partners. And again, establishing those community partnerships is critical to comprehensive mental health approaches and also ties into school climate efforts. Safety is the second component, which helps ensure, oh, you can go back for just a second. Safety is the second component that really helps ensure that schools and school-related activities involving students are safe from violence, bullying, harassment, and substance use. And then environment is really a whole range of things from including appropriate facilities to making sure that our classrooms are well managed, making sure we have available staffing. And so thinking about our staffing ratios and what supports are available there, and also those clear and fair disciplinary practices. So moving ahead, a positive school climate, tapping into these concepts that I just went over of engagement, safety, and environment is a huge protective factor for all students, but especially for those that are at risk of mental health issues and suicide. And we did see this in part through our own state PACE data that was highlighted earlier. We know that a negative school climate has been found to be associated with a range of adverse academic, behavioral, and psychosocial outcomes, and also that it disproportionately affects certain populations of students, including our LGBTQ+ students, students of color, and students with disabilities. But on the other hand, research does suggest that positive school climate can lead to improved academic outcomes among diverse groups of students, also improved motivation to learn, improved staff morale, and not only has short-term benefits, but also has long-term benefits, including serving as that protective factor, supporting positive long-term life outcomes for young people, and also for our staff. So as Dana had mentioned, it's been associated with lower rates of burnout in staff and higher retention rates. So given the many layers of uncertainty that we've all faced over the past year, these are some actionable trauma-informed strategies that are aligned with the trauma-informed care values that Dana talked about earlier. And these strategies are actually drawn from crisis research, but they not only apply to times of crisis or even reentry after periods of school closure, but are really universally applicable at all times to cultivate that safe and supportive learning environment to really maximize students' potential for learning. And so it's really important to balance these concepts. So looking at these, and I know some of these may seem like opposites of one another, but really work in complementary ways. So providing structured routines, which can include things like teaching or reminding students of the target expectation or skill, but also remaining flexible, such as by being able to respond to problems that arise in real time, be able to see those as teachable moments. Remember that what works for one student may not work for all. So where are those areas where students can have options so that they feel empowered? Again, recognizing empowerment as one of those trauma-informed core values. We want our students to feel empowered to be able to choose what works best for them within parameters, of course. And at the same time, we need to help students to prioritize in the same way that we as adults need to, and know that that's an important social emotional learning skill to be able to effectively communicate one's needs, whether you're a student or whether you're a staff member or other adult in a school. We also want to use language that reinforces connectedness. So again, knowing what a huge protective factor that is, how can we use that terminology of we? You know, we'll get through this, or, you know, we're doing the best we can. And we also want to acknowledge that while we've had this shared experience, each student and family story is unique. So we can use this as an opportunity to acknowledge and build connections. We also want to model that self-care, which I know Dana talked about as a buzzword, but it's something that we all need. Students and staff all need to practice that. And it can mean helping students to identify strategies that help them to stay mentally and physically healthy. Again, knowing how much our mental and physical health are intertwined, whether it's things like eating well or getting a good night's sleep. Sometimes it's things like knowing when to limit our exposure to social media or just the news outlets, whether it's finding connections to friends and family, sports, music, you name it. And when we are concerned and when we're noticing some of those changes in behavior that Dana and I highlighted earlier, or any other worrisome signs, we want to make sure that we're empowering staff to reach out and be able to respond effectively, and then also refer, and that we have the necessary tools and protocols to do so. So as we move through the school year and prepare for what the upcoming school year will look like, it's really important that the most important thing that we can do, it's important to recognize that the most important thing that we can do is create a positive, safe, stable, and supportive relationship with youth and cultivate those within our school environment. We know that this continues to be the #1 protective factor for youth and cannot be underscored enough. There was a study that was conducted in December of 2019 that was published regarding positive childhood experiences. So counter to the adverse childhood experiences that we often hear about, this study looked at those positive experiences and adult mental and relational health. And what it found is that fostering safe, stable, nurturing relationships for children affected outcomes later in life, and that the more positive childhood experiences, the higher a child's chances of a positive outcome. So this is the #1, and Dana and I always like to highlight this because it's something that we often don't think about, and one of the most straightforward ways that we can really build this positive learning environment and create a positive climate. But there were a few other positive childhood experiences in that study just to touch upon that are also relevant to the school or community and can be cultivated within the school environment. So those include having at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest, so kind of related to this one, feeling supported by friends, feeling a sense of belonging at high school, and enjoying participating in community traditions. So we really do have a unique opportunity now to focus our planning efforts through this lens of building relationships to support those positive learning environments and enhance those outcomes for students while they're with us in schools well into their adulthood years. In addition to a focus on core strategies, consider the extent to which your district or school is using best practices to actually assess whether you're providing a positive, safe learning environment for all students. And Dana's going to talk a little bit later about some of the resources in Pennsylvania to do so. But as you're assessing your learning environments, there are a range of tools to consider and some just general best practices in school climate assessment. So ensure that your teams are involved. So again, teaming is really critical here to determine the specific data you're wanting to collect. As Dana mentioned, there's no one perfect tool. So it's beneficial to take the time to explore what's out there, what data you actually want to use, and then how you're going to disseminate that to your school community. It's also best practice to use evidence-based assessment tools that do have strong psychometrics and to think about multiple dimensions of school climate. So we showed some key components a little bit earlier, But what are you going to tap into? What are you going to collect data on? Is it student engagement? Is it relationships, safety, or other aspects of the learning environment? And then it's important to get well-rounded input that represents the diversity of your school community. So not just surveying staff or not just surveying students, but considering getting input from all of your different stakeholders or a range of stakeholders so you can really understand some of the differences in perceptions that might be there. Looking at multiple methods of assessment, so not just surveys, but how can you go more in depth and maybe get some qualitative data, whether that's through interviews or focus groups. And then keep in mind that anonymous input is ideal, while also, working to align assessment efforts with the school or district's vision to ensure that the data you're gathering is truly valued by stakeholders. These are some additional classroom and school-wide approaches that help cultivate that safe and supportive learning environment and also align with those trauma-informed core values. Some of these have already been touched upon and they're just reiterated here, but that's really just to underscore that we are all continuing to navigate new and uncharted territory, whether it's been through all of the various re-entries, closures, reopening, shifting from hybrid to virtual to in-person. All of these are going to be really critical as we continue on and we continue to have some uncertainty in how we're proceeding. We've had to more closely supervise and monitor aspects of our learning environments that we never had to think about in the past, including the physical distancing guidelines and general safety that have really shifted what our learning environments have looked like. And we are going to need to continue to do that in order to ensure that physical, emotional, and psychological safety within our schools. We also have some opportunities to provide education now on topics like traumatic stress and mental health. And this can be empowering as knowledge and awareness increases. And then in addition to information, we know that responding with empathy offers that emotional support to both staff and students as they continuously have to adapt. And it helps to create that culture of compassion within our school environments rather than one of fear or shame. So moving ahead, to promote positive behaviors, we know that setting school-wide expectations is a commonly implemented Tier 1 practice, and when done well, can really create environments where students, parents, and staff all understand and demonstrate mutual respect and where positive behaviors are the expectations. So what you're looking at are some best practices for setting school-wide expectations, and this is something that many schools have already taken many steps towards, or you might have this underway if you are implementing a multi-tiered framework like PBIS. But just to touch on a few of these best practices, with setting, make sure you're thinking about the physical layout of the school, and again, now thinking about the physical layout of classrooms to support optimal functioning of staff and students. Usually it's somewhere between 3 to 5 positively stated expectations and making sure that those are posted and also linked and aligned with school rules. And then ensuring that we're bringing in others. This is essential as far as teaching and reinforcing these expectations. And so those others would include our staff, making sure they're trained, the family members, and also our community. And then in terms of implementing school-wide positive reinforcement systems, some of the best practices also include what you're seeing here. We want to ensure, just to highlight a few of these, that we do have reward systems that are implemented consistently and use a variety of methods. We want to make sure we're acknowledging students through specific praise and other strategies to let them know when they're meeting the expectations that we have. Staff can provide prompts and reminders before a behavior is expected to set students up for success and to clearly describe the expectations so students know what they're supposed to do. And then we also need to have that error correction for when a misbehavior occurs. And of course, we need to account for a discipline process where the problem behaviors that may be shown are clearly defined. And we also want to make sure that it's clearly laid out for staff what the appropriate responses are to problem behaviors and what the protocols and supports are around those. So Dana already highlighted a few really important key points about mental health literacy, but this is not a term that we've had so much in our schools previously. We all think of literacy as something completely different to that, but mental health literacy is really the knowledge and beliefs about mental disorders, which aid in their recognition, management, or prevention. And in the context of districts, mental health literacy programs are relevant for students, parents, and staff. So really, we think that as many people as possible that can be trained in a school community in mental health topics to build this literacy and confidence should be trained. So it is about recognizing the warning signs or other indicators, again, observable behaviors when something may become more of a concern. So sometimes we use that term of impact. So when is that behavior truly impacting the student? When is it a significant change from their baseline or how they typically act? This does not mean we're automatically moving to diagnosis, and that's not the purpose here, but it's to just on the early identification side to really notice those changes and know what to do. It's also about addressing the stigma, which Dana mentioned, surrounding mental health challenges or mental illness, and truly trying to normalize that concept of mental health. Again, recognizing and sending this message that mental health is something that we all have to work to maintain. And then in terms of help seeking, we want to encourage our students to reach out before they get to a point where they're really struggling or even in crisis. And for students and staff, for both groups, students and staff, it is important to help them understand how to get help. Sometimes, many of you probably know very well that our students that are struggling don't know that there are in-school supports that they might benefit from, as well as evidence-based treatments in the community, and that recovery is possible, that if they're feeling a particular way that doesn't feel like themselves, that's not the way they always need to be feeling. And some best practices for mental health literacy include collaborating directly with youth and families, especially those that have had lived experience with mental health issues or the mental health system, and also collaborating directly with staff to identify meaningful ways to promote mental health literacy and engage them in this process, allowing for ongoing training and or refreshers, right, rather than a once and done training can help ensure that there's continued knowledge and skills in this area, and also, again, reinforces that message that mental health is a priority. So social emotional learning, to share the definition from CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, SEL is the process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions, and a critical strategy for Tier 1 mental health promotion. A growing research base has demonstrated a range of desired outcomes associated with SEL, and those you're seeing here, particularly around the 5 areas of competency that I'll just talk about briefly. So these competencies include self-awareness, so knowing your strengths and limitations, and again, not just for students, but also for adults, and many adults do struggle with it. Self-management, or how to effectively manage, how to control impulses, how to self-motivate in order to set and achieve your goals. Social awareness, or understanding perspectives of others, as was mentioned, being able to empathize with others, especially when you have a diverse school community. And then relationship skills involve communicating clearly, listening well to others, cooperating with others, and being able to negotiate conflict and problem solve. And the last one is responsible decision-making, just being able to make constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions. And so there are a range of evidence-based SEL curricula and best practice approaches that do teach skills in one or more of these core areas. And there is a tab on PDE's Office for Safe Schools that has more information on those. And so knowing that SEL instruction can be provided in a variety of ways, in Pennsylvania, some of the guidance around this was provided to educators on how to address career-ready skills. And this was in the context of learning for all students. So the Pennsylvania Career Ready skills are aligned with the PA Career Education and Work Standards, and are consistent with the intent of the Future Ready PA Index. And the social emotional progressions that are provided in the PA Career Ready skills support the development of student competence. The Career Ready Skills Continuum and Toolkit are also available on PDE's website, but just to kind of briefly overview the domains that are covered, the first is, you'll see that these are very closely aligned with CASEL's 5 areas. The first is self-awareness and self-management. So again, managing emotions and behavior, self-advocacy, self-awareness, coping with adversity, and goal setting. The second domain is establishing and maintaining relationships, covering relationships, diversity, expressive communication, and managing interpersonal conflict. And the last one is social problem solving, which includes decision-making skills, understanding social awareness, and perspective taking. So I'm now going to turn it back to Dana to highlight some of the data approaches that schools can take.
Thanks, Perry. I think that when we talk about data in terms of academics, everyone thinks immediately of things that come to mind, like data systems, data supports in the school building. Often we don't always think about data for building positive learning environments. And we want to take this opportunity to think about what are data sources that we can use. So one of the ones that we have is the Student Assistance Program. The SAP program really is a way to systematically have data that is reliant on observable behaviors. There's data collections, and it connects school and community resources. We want to highlight that SAP is a key component of school safety legislation, both Act 44 and Act 18. And we now require it to be assessed as part of the school safety effort. So it is a key component as we're building learning environments. Additional data supports that you have already in your school system is your school level data. We collect attendance data and we look at behavioral data and course performance, and even that supplemental support data, which would include children who are experiencing homeless, migrant families, children who have 504s or have IEPs, or students who have English as a second language. When we think of this data, we tend to think of it as in that particular area. So attendance is, do we need attendance improvement plans? What does our attendance look like? Do we need to follow our attendance procedures, or are we having behavioral issues? Are there referrals we need to make? But these school level data sources can really be a wealth of knowledge about what is happening with an individual student. So as Perry talked about, those signs and those symptoms that we see with children who are experiencing trauma and are having mental health concerns, we start seeing things like increase in behavioral referrals, grades decreasing, increases in calls home, attendance concerns. And when we start looking at the school level data and we start looking at changes in individual students, this really can be a key indicator for us that something is going on in a child's life that we need to look at further. As I mentioned earlier, the staff and student wellness checklist is also school level data, and it's where you need to look at in your school in order to focus on what communications do I need as we move forward into reopening. What do I need in terms of next school year, in terms of how do I structure my classrooms? Where am I in terms of supervision in the hallways? Where am I in terms of rubrics that need revised if they're currently in place in the school? And again, the organizational self-care checklist is very similar. Really thinking about, as an organization, how do I engage in self-care that supports my staff and supports my administrators so they can support staff, and then staff can support students and families. As we know, if we're empty and we just cannot give anymore and we've reached our emotional capacity, we can't support others. And so we really want to take this idea to an organizational level and think about, if as an organization, we aren't supporting our administrators, how can they have everything they need to support staff? If we're not supporting staff, how do they have what they need to support students? And then of course, supporting our students. Perry talked about our school climate, and she spent time talking about assessing school climate. And in Pennsylvania, there is a free tool for assessing school climate. This can be found on the Department of Education's website, and these surveys are intended to provide schools with formative and summative climate data so that you can use this with your needs assessment, look at your strengths, how do you engage in program development, and how do you engage in short and long-term planning. These surveys are available for grades 3 to 5, 6 to 8, 9 to 12, and then staff and faculty, parents, and community members. So this recently went through a validation process and has psychometrics attached to it. And based on those, the validation process, what the 3 domains now are student support, which this is a scale that really looks at, do students feel listened to? Do they feel cared about and helped by other educational professionals in the school? And so when we think back to what Perry talked about in terms of connectedness, this is really looking at that connectedness, which we know is a key protective factor for our youth. And then the social emotional learning. This is looking at your students' perceptions of their peers. So social and problem solving skills. Again, tying back into the PACE data, as well as those protective factors and the positive childhood experiences that Perry had talked about, knowing that that connectedness with peers and feeling peer support is another major protective factor for our youth. And then lastly, looking at school safe and respective climates. So this really measures 2 things. Are we physically safe? So do students feel physically and safe in their building? And also emotional safety. So when we talked about the trauma-informed values, we talked about safety, and this helps us recognize safety is more than physical. Again, it's that physical, it's emotional, it's social, it's academic, it's how do we address all of this together to create an environment where kids not only feel physically safe, but youth wants to come to school. And then one of the other resources that we want to talk about in terms of data is the Equitable Practices Hub. So the Equitable Practices Hub is also found on the Department of Education's website. And one of the data pieces that is really critical for schools to start with is this Equity Consortium criteria for an equitable school tool. So it allows you to take that look into, am I engaging in equity practices that are creating a safe, supportive climate for my students and my staff? And then resources are available through the different pillars, which include general equity, self-awareness, family and community engagement, data practices, disciplinary equity, and then academic equity. So when we think about data, we know that data doesn't mean anything if we're not tying it to something. And so one of the things we want to highlight through the Equitable Practices Hub is that there is supports available for regardless of what you find when you do your equitable assessment. You can look at resources from a school lens, from a classroom lens, or as an individual lens. And the same is true for our school climate. When we're thinking about school climate and we want to move forward, every IU has a school climate resource coordinator who's able to provide supports, and we also provide technical assistance through the Department of Education. Something that is not tied to the Department of Education is the School Health Assessment and Performance Evaluation System. This system, the SHAPE system, is a collaborative effort between the National Center for School Mental Health and the University of Maryland School of Medicine. This is a free assessment and resource that can be used to assess school mental health quality in schools or districts. So when we think about the SHAPE system, it's really important to highlight that A, it's free. And when there are additional presentations for the Accelerated Learning Series that will be posted this week, and they actually walk through the SHAPE in detail and how they can support your accelerated learning plan. But for now, we just want to make sure that we're introducing you to this resource and providing a quick overview of what it can provide. So please know that if you access the recorded webinars that are on the website for accelerated learning, there is an in-depth look to this. But in general, what it does is it allows you as a school team to assess the different domains, including teaming, needs assessment or resource mapping, screening, mental health promotion services and supports, which is also universal practices or tier 1, And then early intervention and treatment services and supports, which is tier 2 and 3, funding and sustainability, and then impact. Again, as Perry mentioned, impact is so important. If we're doing data practices that support our students, we want to make sure we're having the impact that we think we're having. And so the SHAPE assessment allows you to look at all of these areas. It seems overwhelming, but it takes an hour or less to complete and provide you with strategic planning guides and a summary report of each domain. So at the end of the report, there's a whole strategic planning guide that allows you to look at each domain as well as the individual areas and how they all compare. So the domains will come out in red, green, or yellow, and they include mastery, progressing, or emerging. I think it's important to say when we're working with schools, schools really want to see everything in the mastery or emerging stage, and the National Center on School Mental Health is really quick to note that these are best practices. So they have never had a school who is 100% in mastery or mastery and emerging, because these are things that we need to change daily or yearly and make sure that we're updating and we're addressing to look at our impact and how we address our student and staff mental wellness. One of the things that I love about the SHAPE assessment when we think about what comes next, okay, we have our data, now what comes next? Even if your school does not do a formal SHAPE assessment, there is a resource center, and this contains many, many, many resources and exemplars from states and sites. And it also contains these quality guides. So the quality guides are present for all of the domains, and they have background on the individual domain. What are best practices? What are action steps you can take in order to address this domain? Examples from the field and resources, and all of those examples are actually linked in the SHAPE Resource Center. So when we think about the what comes next, as we're dealing with our data and how we address it, this is a really good way to kind of have that laid out for you and give you a starting point so that you're not starting from scratch. Perry and I are both huge believers in we don't start from scratch. How do you take what is out there and the best practice resources and adapt them for the individual schools and individual systems you're working with, so that we can continue to make advancements and we continue to progress in the field. So we have many opportunities for learning and networking ahead, and I want to highlight them quickly, and then we will have a few minutes for questions. So please, if you have any, please feel free to pop them in the question and answer, and we'll make sure to answer them. So for the development of supportive learning environments, the posted webinars will include planning for success, moving to action, teaming for success, and mobilization of staff and student wellness. Again, they will be posted this week. When we're thinking about what these look like, planning for success is really that data piece. How do you look at your data? How do you engage in school improvement cycles and really look at data in a systematic way that is tiered towards or geared towards rather mental health? And how do we look at this and tie it into the data we're using for academics so that we're not doing one more thing, but really tying everything together? Moving to action is really a needs assessment and resource mapping and helping you walk through that process. And then teaming for success is one that I think is really important, not that they are not all important, but if you can view only a couple, I think teaming is one of those areas that is really important because it sets up the other areas. When we think about teaming and I say we want to look at a team, many of you are going, oh my gosh, Dana, please do not tell me you want us to develop one more team. And the reason we focused and made sure that we did a teaming for success is because we want you to recognize that you don't have to develop another team, that we understand staff capacity is at its maximum, and that we really want to walk you through a way of looking at the teams that are present in your district and your school and thinking about how do we align them? How do we integrate these concepts that we talked about today into teams that are already there? So we are not asking you to do one more thing on top of everything that you're already doing, but rather we're looking at developing staff capacity for support and connectedness. And then the mobilization of staff and student wellness really builds on what Perry and I had talked about earlier in terms of how do you address this when it comes to building mental health promotion in your school? What does it look like when we're really thinking about staff wellness and compassion fatigue? And then we know that this is new for many of you. And so we want to invite you to collaborative check-in sessions. These sessions that are listed here are also available to link in on Patton's website. And what these sessions are designed for is for districts, school individuals, anyone to pop in and have someone from the Department of Education help you problem solve. What is going well, but you need more support with? What are you really struggling with and you need more resources around? It's an opportunity for open technical assistance. And so we really want to invite you to join us for one or several of these sessions so that we're able to meet your needs and support you as you move forward. As we take questions and answers, we do just want to remind you that in order to get credit for this session, you do need to open up this link and put in the exit code for this session. I'm going to invite everyone to ask questions in the chat or in the question and answer. And if there are not any, Perry and I are just going to highlight a resource that we want to present to you. So we'll give it a second. Okay, Perry, since I don't see any questions, do you want to highlight the Compassion Resilience Toolkit? Is that what you were thinking?
Sure, I can highlight that. I was also going to mention the Suicide Prevention Online Learning Center, but I can talk about both briefly.
Let me put this one up and I'll pull the other one up for you.
Oh, absolutely. So the Compassion Resilience Toolkit comes out of Wisconsin. It was developed collaboratively with their Department of Education and some local mental health organizations. And really, so this is another free resource, and that's been a big focus of what we've been trying to highlight here today. But there are toolkits for educators, for human services or social services, and also for families. And they're all very much aligned, but obviously tailored to those specific audiences. They come with ready-made materials, agendas, guides. Everything is developed for you. But what this does is just provides a tool to look at compassion fatigue and reframing that into compassion resilience, especially for staff. Far too often we see self-care as kind of like a once and done training, and this allows for school systems especially to really build this in comprehensively and in an ongoing way. It's not meant for staff that are experiencing difficulties, but meant as a universal approach. And really just, builds in both the organizational component to wellness and compassion resilience, as well as a really nice model for individual wellness with a lot of reflective activities. So everything is here on this website, and it's something that, someone within your school or district could facilitate, or something that you could also partner with one of your community partners to look at something for your staff.
And before I put up the Prevent Suicide PA Online Learning Center, the other thing I just want to mention about this one that I know Perry and I absolutely love, both having been school psychologists in a school setting, is that there is a facilitator guide. All the activities are already developed out for you. You can modify them, but it is something that you're able to do without starting from scratch and having to develop it on your own. And there's a lot of great resources that are there.
So thank you for pulling this one up as well. And again, in line with the free resources and the ready-made resources, this would be something, I know we talked about mental health literacy, which is much broader than suicide prevention, but knowing that schools do have training requirements for suicide prevention and building literacy around that and how it's aligned with your comprehensive efforts, this is something that we were able to develop through grant funding that offers a range of trainings including a comprehensive course that is about 4 hours long, but it's broken into 8 30-minute modules focused on gatekeeper topics, so general suicide prevention for your entire staff, and can help your school district to meet some of the legislative requirements, Act 71. But it also, even though it's not structured in a tiered way, I know we're talking about tiered supports and tiered training today, and while it has that general content, it also has some of the added, more advanced topics that are relevant to your school mental health professionals and administrators as well. So there are trainings on things like suicide risk assessment and safety planning. And in addition to that, since Dana mentioned the facilitator guides with the Compassion Resilience Toolkit, we are also this summer going to be posting facilitator guides for those gatekeeper modules. Just knowing that suicide prevention is a topic that people often want to dialogue about and get to ask questions about. If you think your staff would benefit from more of that interaction, the facilitator guides will be posted so that a school psychologist or school counselor could take the recorded content and then have interactive dialogue and facilitated conversation with staff to also be used to meet those requirements and beyond.
And then, as was noted, everything will be posted on PDE's roadmap website, and you can access, including this presentation. And Perry and I have included a bunch of additional resources for you in here that include the websites that you were looking for earlier, as well as resources to help you move forward in your journey. And our contact information is also here if you have questions or we need to, you need link to someone else, we would be happy to do that for you.